All right, you got Robin, myself, Charlie here chatting. Um, First one that I want to chat on was some of the issues facing wildland firefighters. So I was kind of inspired to look a little bit more deeply into this. I was chatting with a friend of mine here in Montana who has been a hotshot for the last 5 years, and he decided to call it before last season. And it was just kind of interesting because, he had a lot of experience on the fire line. He was Marine infantry before that. So definitely, a guy who likes that kind of work, and I was just chatting on him on his reasons. He said, just basically there's no career there. It's really challenging. So if you're unfamiliar with it, the vast majority of wildland firefighters are seasonal employees. So they get called up in the spring, they work their asses off during the summer, and then they get let go in the early fall or late summer, depending on the fire season. And then they're off, which is, I think, a draw to a lot of guys initially, but they're off, so they don't have any benefits. There's no health insurance. There's obviously no paycheck. So it's a challenging dynamic for a lot of guys, and there are full-time year-round spots, but they're few and far between, and they're generally not paid very well. Anyways, I was just looking at an article. There's a big smoke jumper base here in Missoula, and kind of one of the first, I believe. It's got a lot of history to it. But if you get hired on full-time, you're going to be getting paid $66,000, which is, 5 years ago was probably a good salary for this area. But now, you can't find a house within a 30-minute radius of the area for.
Are there some guys at this base who are full-time? Probably a few of the leadership, right?
A few. Yeah. But you can't find a house around here for less than $500,000. So, that's problematic. So I think just to lay the base, the groundwork for this, like some brief explanation of what these guys do. So they work as crews. Wildland firefighters are all over the country, but primarily located in the Mountain West and West. Basically everywhere where you see traditionally the fires blow up. There's crews, but the crews are spread amongst a lot of different agencies. So the biggest is the Forest Service, but there's also fire crews through Bureau of Land Management. There's local crews. There's tribal crews for areas on reservations, and then there's private companies that also lend out manpower. And there's kind of various.
Well, do you know? Just before we go on, I know that maybe that's the salary, but when they go and fight fires, do they, like the seasonal guys? Do you have an idea what those guys make? Do they get paid overtime? I imagine they do.
Yeah. So they get paid overtime, and that's how they really make their money. So there was recently a bump for the minimum salary at $15 an hour. So that was bumped up from $12. But these guys make their money from overtime, right? So they go out on 14-day assignments generally, which can be extended up to 30. So if you're a Missoula hotshot, you might go down to New Mexico for 14 days and might get extended to 30, but your time clock, your work clock is ticking constantly around those 14 days. So they make a nice chunk of money for sure. It can range. It really depends on the number of fires and the number of overtime hours worked, but it can range from 40 all the way up to $70,000 during a fire season.
And they so do they only make overtime if they're fighting fires? Because their work is, he says, 14 on, 3 days off, and if their work day so they have to be on duty, even though they're not fighting a fire, kind of at ready. And so that's when they'll be making like $15 an hour. And then I guess if they do fight a fire, that's when their hours expand. And so that's when they get time and a half or whatever.
Well, no, not necessarily. Right? No, not necessarily. I mean, it's traditional, right? So if you're over 40 hours in a week, that's when your overtime
Got it.
starts to collect. Yeah. So, that can be anything. That could be uh doing um fuel management work in the early season, right? Where they're doing controlled burns and stuff like that. But obviously, where that stuff really starts to accumulate in terms of time is on the fire line because they're just there constantly working. But I mean, you got a $15 an hour times 1.5, which is the overtime rate, is $22.50 an hour. So you're still pretty low pay.
So when they're working overtime and making that much money, they're doing a lot of overtime.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You see in some of the reports I was looking at, you see the number of hours these guys worked overtime, and it's pretty insane. I mean, it's pretty much the whole summer. They're just on it.
I
Their
didn't know.
time clock is
I
ticking.
did a story just kind of I got a story in a Reddit kind of before I saw this, and it was about Cal Fire, which is I think California state
Yep.
firefighters, primarily Wildland, and they just signed some type, and they're full time, and they just signed. They're unionized and just signed an agreement to reduce their work hours to 66 hours a week. And previously they would be up like 72 to 96 hours a week or something. And that's, full time during the fire season, which is interesting. I don't know how they're going to do that from a manpower perspective, but with all the fires in California, those guys are just work.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing to recognize is, you've got these crews, whether it's Forest Service or a state-run organization like Cal Fire, they go everywhere. So you'll see guys from Montana traveling down to, you know, Southern California and vice versa. It's kind of strange. You'll see this, like, I don't know if you ever saw it in Wyoming, but I'll always see up here guys, like local guys, traveling out of state while there's a fire in process in the region, and you'll have out of state guys coming to Montana. So it's kind of a strange, I'm sure it's like a asset management kind of approach. You got certain guys who can do certain things, and they need them to be in certain areas. But it's always kind of funny. You're like, why do we have California guys coming to Montana? Well, Montana guys are leaving. But they did recently get a pay bump. I think it was one of the bills that Biden passed. It was kind of snuck in there to bump their pay up to 15, and that will grow, but it's still a problem for these guys. The the number of fires has increased on average, and probably more importantly, the seasonality of the fire season has extended dramatically. So they're just starting much, much earlier, and ending much later. And that's a big problem because a lot of these guys are college students, right? So it's a summer job. But when your fire season is starting in May, right in the middle of finals, you have the significant manpower issue there. Forest Service reported they had a shortfall of 25% of their personnel at the beginning of the season. They eventually got to full staffing, but it takes a while, and a lot of those guys are college students, so there's some issues there for sure. So it's just kind of an interesting deal, and I'm sure anybody who lives in the Mountain West has seen just the huge variety of organizations that do wildland firefighter work. And it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me on the surface level, how these guys are structured. You just got so many different organizations, and they all have to come together on a big fire line. They all use the incident command structure that FEMA puts out, so they're all speaking the same language, which is good, but it still looks like herding cats. Just so many different organizations coming in at different times and all that stuff.
And going to I know that one of the things and you mentioned in your work here is the lifestyle part, and so it's kind of because I knew several like ski instructors and Jackson, who would take and be wildland firefighter in the summer, and then ski instructor in the winter. And what that allowed them to do would get their springs and their falls pretty much off, and they would
Right.
take 6-week trips to climb or kayak or Baja or whatever, and they really liked that kind of lifestyle. And these weren't college students; these were post college students. So it seems like there are a few people who do that, post college.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's been a big draw for a lot of guys. Kind of initially, it's like, oh, sweet, I'll work my ass off in the summer and then chase powder in the winter. Um, but that's getting, that time window off is getting less and less. It's challenging, and it seems like all of those guys tend to hit a point where they realize they got to do something else, just like my buddy, it just doesn't, they just can't make it work financially any longer, which I guess is probably, that's not necessarily uncommon to see the same thing across the board for any kind of mountain profession.
Yeah, service jobs, everything.
Yeah. But, those service jobs don't fight fire. It's a
It
critical
seems
job.
also, I remember I was surprised to see how many fires like in Florida. And
Yeah.
in some of the off seasons or Texas, during the winter, there'll be raging wildland fires going, which draw these resources and what you say kind of are limiting the seasonal aspect of it.
Yeah, there's been a pretty significant increase of fires on the East Coast generally, and like specifically the Southeast, which is usually a pretty wet area, and didn't used to burn, but things are just a bit drier now. And it was interesting. I started, as a firefighter in Charleston, South Carolina, and they had, Charleston, South Carolina is built on a marsh. It's wet, and because of a couple fires that had happened, they'd had to invest a pretty significant amount of money into wildland equipment because, an urban style fire truck will not work on a wildland fire and vice versa. So they are almost duplicating their equipment to a degree in order to be able to combat that threat, and it's increased across the East Coast. So you're talking about a significant chunk of money for municipalities that might not have the budget otherwise.
I think you're going to your solutions now. Did these solutions you have come in terms of recruiting come from you, or were these part of what you gleaned from the articles you looked at?
A combination of both. I hadn't seen any. Well, I'll go into. It seems like an obvious solution to follow something that looks like the U.S. military reserve system, right? So these guys, as it stands right now, they're all seasonal. And so when they get let go at the end of the year, they're done, right? They don't talk to their crews. They might text their crew or something like that, but they're certainly not getting paid, and they're certainly not drawing any benefits. So it makes sense to me to follow the U.S. military reserve structure, which is generally, you go through your training, you get paid full time. If you get deployed or something like that, you're getting paid full time, obviously. But when you're in a reserve status, you maintain your benefits, which was one of the big issues I saw over and over again in articles that I read for wildland firefighters is, they just don't get benefits. They're really risking it. And they're certainly not putting anything towards like a retirement system until they get hired on full time, if they ever do. So that seems like a fairly obvious answer there. And they're having issues recruiting talent, so recruiting bodies. So, add some incentives in there, like some variety of the GI Bill. If this is like a real concern for the country, right? And it certainly is for a pretty big chunk of it, provide some GI Bill like benefits for these guys. You do 4 years of wildland firefighting, then you're going to get some education benefits or something along those lines. I think there's a million ways you can do that. What that also do is enable like a group that's more easily able to be called up, right? So as opposed to the current structure where guys get laid off and they're not getting called back up until a certain date. If something were to pop up early, like a fire pops up early in the season, at least you have this roster that you can call up pretty quick and activate pretty quickly and all that good stuff. So that seemed like a pretty obvious one to me. The other benefit of that is, the reserves do a drill schedule. So, 2 days a month or whatever the case may be. You can use those to do more bodies for controlled burn work, which is really kind of the biggest tasker for these guys early in the season that helps prevent fires from really blowing up quickly. The second was, I mentioned it already, but these guys are spread out amongst a ton of different departments. So Forest Service, BLM, tribal, state, etc. It seems like this should be, at least the command structure aspect of it should be centralized, because I can only imagine the amount of issues involved with having this interagency operability stuff. And
primarily it's what BLM, the Forest Service, are the two federal agencies, and then I don't know if there's. I did read where one of the I read articles was on Oregon's Department of Forestry ran out of money to fund wildland firefighters. I'm not too sure if they were paying federal wildland firefighters or if they have their own state crews. I know California has state crews. Wyoming didn't have state wildland fire crews, state employed that were state employed that I'm aware of. Do you know if Montana has state employed wildland firefighters like Cal Fire does?
No, not state employed. I think California is the only state that has a state-run organization like that. But
you'll have like local fire departments will respond on something. Okay, got it.
Yeah, local crews, and just to give an example. So I was, after I was in Charleston, we moved out to Montana, and I was working for a department out here, and it's a full-time career department focusing on, the city of Missoula. And these guys there was all these opportunities to do these wildland deployments. And so these guys would go, I never did one, but these guys would go for 10 days to 2 weeks. And they're rolling overtime the whole time. And, it's not the department paying for that. Obviously it's whatever state has a fire, right? So if there's a California fire and you put a request out for more personnel, the state is paying that bill, right? They pay the department directly.
So they pay Forest Service or whoever.
So in this case they pay the fire department. That's
the local fire department. Got it.
Yeah, yeah. And so there's some issues there because these guys are career firefighters at you got a captain making whatever $80,000 a year, you're running his overtime rate for however many hours are in 2 weeks, right? That's a pretty significant bill. So it's obviously like not particularly cost efficient, and usually that was just like two guys. So there's just a lot of inefficiencies there. It seemed to make sense to centralize these guys, and I think at this point, with how significant the increase in wildland fires has been, it should probably be put under Homeland Security, right? They have a way bigger budget. So BLM is under the Department of Interior. The Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture, neither of which have any discretionary funds, whereas Homeland Security has a shit ton, right? So to me, it's like you use the Coast Guard example. If the Coast Guard is under the Department of Homeland Security now, doing protective work on the shores, it makes sense that you would have a similar construct for wildland fire. And then additionally, making regional commands to have, it just seems silly that you got California firefighters responding to stuff out here in Montana and vice versa, guys going all over the place. If there's a way to more regionally align this, so, for example, something like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming is one region, or Montana, Idaho, Washington, which is what how the Canadian wildland firefighters organize it. So they're all provincially run, and that's where they draw their manpower internally, and then they have mutual aid agreements from province to province, obviously, for something that's really big.
I know that when I was in the Coast Guard, I was under the Department of Transportation, and we were always kind of a ugly sister there, even though it was considered a military force. The reason for that was because Coast Guard enforced domestic law, and the military can't do that. I guess under the Homeland Security, it still works. I'm just looking at the other agencies in Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, Coast Guard, TSA, ICE, but FEMA is under Homeland Security, and FEMA, coordinates disaster response, recovery, mitigation efforts. And so I think the idea that you're a new agency for wildland fire would fit in here well, for sure. I know that just one of the news sources I look for Homeland for a RET when I put that together is Homeland Security type website, and they often include wildland fire stories, earthquakes, hurricanes, stuff like that.
Yeah, they've done a lot of work there. Actually, I was looking through the website, just in terms of research and kind of policy white papers. They've done a lot of work there already, so it seems like that's not a reach, And then the last kind of easy solution would, from my mind, is increase pay and or provide some variety of housing for wildland firefighters and have them on contract, right? So this all kind of works together. If you're a wildland firefighter here in Montana, especially Western Montana, you're not going to be able to find housing, right? Unless you've got 6 guys to a house, which I'm sure is what most of them do. It's a really challenging dynamic right now. And so being able to provide some simple housing for these guys, potentially that they can use off season, I don't see any issue with that. It's obviously there's some cost there, but I mean, this is a big problem for the Mountain West.
Boy, that'd be a little tricky there.
For sure.
I think that the problem, I guess the consideration is many more, the fact is many more wildland firefighters are needed during the summer, and that's why they got to staff up. And so I guess if you had are you suggesting that they increase the number of permanent wildland firefighters, or go to the more reserve model that you're talking about?
No, I think going to the reserve model. I mean, it doesn't seem like there is necessarily the need. I could be wrong on this, but based on what I've read and the guys I've talked to, there's not necessarily the need to have more full-time guys, right? Because there's really just not a ton of work to do in the off season.
Right.
But because the fire season has gotten so much longer, guys are in the area longer, or they live in the area full time, and so they're
you can't rely on college students to fill in.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you could $15 an hour as a starting rate seems crazy low to me. I'm sure there's some funding issues with that, but it seems like you see over and over again, like these guys just kind of get screwed because of a couple little pieces of language in the federal bureaucracy that prevents them from getting increases, which is why it had to go to like the president signing a bill to increase pay from $12 to $15 an hour. But the housing,
and that was recent, right?
Yeah, I think that was part of like the Inflation Reduction Act.
Got it.
And the housing is over and over again repeated. There's actually I'll link a bunch of articles in the notes, but there's 3 wildland firefighters who I think do some research out of a university, and they've done a ton of surveys, large surveys, and that's over and over again. That's one of the biggest issues is the housing, right? I mean, if you look at cost of real estate for rent or for purchase in the Mountain West over the last 5 years, it's doubled, so it's a really challenging time kind of for everybody, but certainly for these
And
guys.
I didn't see this in Megan's article that she wrote for us, but so if you are a hotshot crew member in Montana, you're on duty during the summer, there's no fire going on. Where do you live?
Exactly.
In your house?
Yeah.
Because you're working every day, right? What do like college students? If you have a college student coming from, New York or something, where does that person live? Do you know? Or they're housing on their own?
It's on their own.
Got it.
Yep. It's on their own. I'm sure there's plenty of guys who set up a cot on the base and, just kind of call it there. But it's, nobody's doing anything for them in terms of housing or helping them find housing or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know. The housing thing would be difficult, although I know in Jackson right now and in many, I'm sure other places, Aspen, other places where any business that wants to expand, or many of the businesses there are actively buying properties and providing housing for their employees. I think there are some county regulations to that effect. If you want to expand a business or start a new business, you have to address housing for your people.
Yeah.
But there are several, Jackson has 2 substantial bedroom communities with people who work there. Does Missoula have a bedroom community? I think Bozeman does right now, or where people commute in from a cheaper place to buy real estate to Missoula.
Yeah, to a degree, but they're still really not any more affordable. So like, what was Driggs, right? Like Driggs is one of the which is just north of Jackson in Idaho. That's one of the fastest growing real estate markets in terms of price. So it's like those bedroom communities are rapidly decreasing because you had an increase of folks who moved out to the Mountain West, over the past several years, and comes down to affordability for these guys. And people don't build apartment buildings. They build the ranchette house on 5 acres, which is obviously the dream for a lot of people, but probably not what necessarily the community needs.
Yeah, the Homeland Security federal agency would be, like you said, some way to nationally coordinate. Because I've been contacted, from fitness perspective and other perspectives, wellness and other things from permanently employed wildland firefighters with CAL FIRE, with BLM. And I think there is an interagency. Isn't there an interagency headquarters? Do you know, for wildland fire? It seems like there's somebody contacted me from that. I'll look it up, but I can't remember.
Interagency? I don't think so. I think those are on call on a fire scene when like the incident command structure gets built up. But there could be.
That would be like interagency is just BLM and Forest Service, I guess. The idea of the reserve thing is really, I think, pertinent even in my small Wyoming county, which is, there's no permanent firefighters there, and the volunteer firefighters went to county and argued successfully to get retirement benefits after serving for so many years. I don't think they're at the county level, but it was something for their time. I thought that was interesting, and that's in line with what you're talking about. There is a National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, and maybe they are the ones who help coordinate. Looks like they work with the Forest Service, BLM, Park Service. Oh, I forgot Park Service. Oh, yeah, Bureau of Indian Affairs. I've heard of those crews helping. Yep. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fire Administration. I'd never even heard of that. NOAA, state agencies. I have no idea how big this is, but and I don't know what department they're under. Maybe they're only out there anywhere. But well,
Yeah, and you
interesting. I
think,
think the recruitment issue is like you said. I mean, what 25% below the beginning of the season, they're able to fill it up finally.
yeah, yeah, and they've got a year to year a 45% attrition rate, which is significant. So half your force is no longer there. So half your force are rookies year over year, which is obviously in a dangerous profession is challenging.
Yeah, I've looked at that before. Just the danger of wildland fire. You know, I read all the time about just in with a ret. Weekly urban firefighters are killed one way or the other. Um, what I read recently were like 25% of urban firefighters are killed by vehicle collisions.
Yeah.
But just the danger there, and it's not on that level for wildland firefighters. But when the major incidents do, it's not just one person. I think that the Yarnell fire, there were 19 or so wildland firefighters killed in Arizona. That was several years ago, but um, yeah, it's definitely dangerous, and it's a young man's job. I mean, the physical load of it is, especially when they're fighting a fire, the hours and the physical work is in line with, I would say, combat for U.S. soldiers for sure. So it's a young man's game. I imagine some people just tap out after getting 30 or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it just seems like that's going to be similar to the military, right? Where the vast majority of the force is between 18 and 24, because especially for guys in, I guess, combat arms professions, super taxing physically. But the point I was going to make is you listed off all those agencies. You think about if somebody does want to make a career of it, you are pretty much relegated to looking just at your agency in terms of getting a full-time position, right? So despite the fact that there's 25,000 slots, you've got guys in a Forest Service, maybe there's an opening in the BLM, but if you've ever gone to what is it? What's the USA Jobs? I mean, it's a fucking nightmare trying to switch over agencies and stuff like that. So there's all these obstacles in place for these guys that seem kind of artificial. It probably was fine 25 years ago, but it doesn't seem like it's particularly well organized for what fire seasons are now, and will likely get worse.
Yeah, I know there's so many different elements to that. On the fitness side, there's definitely a huge variety in terms of fitness professionalism from unit to unit and firefighter to firefighter. The fitness assessment to I think for the base fitness assessment for both the Forest Service and BLM is just it's called a pack test. I think it's like 3 miles and wearing a 45-pound pack. You have to walk around a track. You can't run. It's not, or weight fast. It's nothing significant. And then each crew will generally have either its own unofficial fitness assessment or unofficial test. Megan talks about in her crew where it's, every day, the first 2 weeks they deploy, they go to the unit, they have to climb 2,000 feet in under an hour wearing like 45-pound pack, which is no joke assessment. But that's just for that unit. And I've seen other individual units have similar type unit specific traditions or tests. But then the professionalism across from the fitness perspective from unit to unit varies greatly. And I'm just wondering if the same isn't true about the technical aspects of it. We have maybe some crews are better prepared technically or than others. I'm sure there are. Anyway, what you're pointing to, I think, is a bigger idea of standardizing and professionalizing the entire service, the effort.
Yeah, it seems like something needs to be changed there. I mean, it's a growing problem that doesn't really get much lip service. I'm surprised he doesn't get more attention from uh, local politicians, state representatives, senators, etc. I mean, it's obviously an issue, but you don't see very many advocates for it in Congress, at least that make the news. Maybe it's just not something that makes the news.
Yeah, the only thing that really makes it, well, I mean, and if you think about the news would be something that would drive it. The town in Maui, which was destroyed a couple years ago, if I understand correctly, that's the most deadly wildland fire ever. Over 100 people were killed. But then there was, I can't remember the name of the town in California a few years before that. And there were, I can't remember how many people were killed, but there were some harrowing stories. I remember in major news publications about people escaping or not escaping. And then you'd see the town just totally destroyed. But it seems that the only time it kind of comes to national attention is when there's, buildings destroyed or, major incidents like Yarnell, where a lot of wildland firefighters get, killed, in duty. But for just a regular fire, where there aren't any structures and structures can be destroyed. There was a fire in real close to my house in Wyoming a few years ago where there were several houses destroyed and it never reached national news. There were, I can't remember how they were, but over a dozen, I think, were destroyed in the fire. And maybe that's just because as there are more and more fires, they're less and less newsworthy.
Yeah, that could be it. I'm not sure. Seems like it's something that needs to be not reactive, though. You would think a whole town in California getting burnt down would do something, but it really didn't make any changes to the organizational structure. Not that I don't think anybody did anything wrong in terms of the fire service in that regard, but just seems crazy that it doesn't get more coverage, more advocates in DC to get some additional funding for these guys to let them do their work.
Yeah, I know that fire in Hawaii was a combination of kind of some slow response, but there were some incredible winds because of a close by hurricane, and just kind of a combination. I mean, I'd never even heard of a wildland fire in Hawaii before that. I know that there was, the cause was electrical line or what that. I just saw there was a big settlement that came through. But if you have a situation like that or California where you have winds blowing a certain way, I don't know how you stop the things. It's just interesting for sure. Let's go ahead. Are you ready to pivot to a new topic? I got a big one for us.
Yeah, hit it.
So there's a story in the Red about South Korea, and South Korean defense minister said that South Korea was open to the idea of developing or building its own nuclear weapons arsenal. And I just thought this was really interesting, and it got my mind spooling. And if you think about South Korea, Japan, in Australia, perhaps in New Zealand, I guess Australia is where more, I think we have a defense compact with New Zealand, but New Zealand's a little bit out there. Anyway, Australia, those countries, if the threat is China or anybody else, but China specifically, Taiwan is another one, I guess, they rely on U.S.'s nuclear capability to be a deterrent against China from using nukes. And this defense minister said that the country was open to do that. And then in that same story, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, that if South Korea wanted to do that, the U.S. shouldn't reject it. I think I've heard the same type of thing, maybe not nuclear weapons for Japan, but definitely they wanted to increase their own military spending and capabilities because of the threat from China. And this made me think about, Poland and the Europe and NATO. And just last week, Putin officially said he was going to change or had changed the Russian nuclear use doctrine, such that if Russia is attacked by a country which is backed by another country which has nuclear weapons, then Russia will use that backing as an excuse to perhaps use nuclear weapons. And so what this means to me is that he's officially either saber rattling or changing it, saying that Russia now is open to use tactical nuclear weapons, at least against Ukraine because of Ukraine's excursion into Russia. I'm thinking Poland must be thinking about this. We talked about Poland last week, and some of the other countries in the Baltics who have shared borders with Russia. And Liz Cheney, former representative from Wyoming, just came out with a new book, and then also just recently, I don't know if you saw this or not, but Dick Cheney endorsed Vice President Harris for president. And there's also something came out of our campaign where like over 200 former national security officials and generals also endorsed her for president. And I think the primary reasons I understand it is the belief from that wing of the Republican Party in terms of the traditional U.S. or traditional since the Cold War U.S. Presence and posture in terms of protecting commitment to NATO and using, given the NATO countries, the protection of our nuclear arsenal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Vice, the new America First type foreign policy of the Trump campaign right now. And so I did see that Liz Cheney had suggested in some of, Liz Cheney was a representative from Wyoming, and she lost after she came out against Trump or voted for Trump's impeachment. She lost her primary like by 40 points in Wyoming. And so, but there's a segment of the Republican Party, maybe the Cheney wing, who have very different views about foreign policy. That is kind of on an island right now. She suggested, creating a new party. And I think there are some Democrats who feel the same. But anyway, just got me thinking about the U.S. Policy and what could happen if indeed Trump was elected. And we do know that, at least from the Republican side right now, at least in the short term, his influence has definitely changed the U.S. posture in terms of foreign policy with the, his opposition to forever wars in Iraq and now the criticism against, all the wars and terrorism, that it seems that most people agreed to was just a huge, mistake. But anyway, I think this is just really interesting. If we did, going back to the nuclear thing, if I was Japan or South Korea or Poland, or some of these other, because I know that France and Britain have nuclear weapons, but Germany doesn't. As far as I know, and no other NATO country does, and they're relying on the U.S. Nuclear arsenal to protect them. Anyway, if you have this situation of pretty rapid nuclear proliferation, can't even say that word right. South Korea gets nukes, Japan gets nukes, and then all the NATO countries have concerns to get their own nuclear arsenals. I'm just I don't know. It just makes me think about what would that mean for the future of defense and possibility of nuclear conflict. Certainly, that would increase it. I know that in South Korea, I have read about the potential of. Have you read about the game or the war games for a war between North Korea and South Korea? I understand that there's so many artillery weapons that North Korea has, and Seoul is actually in the range of some of those, and you can sense that South Korea would want that nuclear deterrent to prevent that type of attack. Anyway, I don't mean to ramble here, but it just seemed that there is some change afoot. Certainly, the majority of, or the winning, I guess certainly officially, the Republican Party in the U.S.'s stance in terms of defense and the U.S.'s posture in the rest of the world has changed, and seems that for sure we don't want to be as, or the Republicans Party doesn't want to be as expansionist as it has in the past. And this has other countries thinking about the traditional protection that U.S. has provided, and that might significantly change. And that would lead to the obvious need or want to get their own nuclear arsenals,
Yeah.
which certainly raises stakes. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know Japan has made a pretty significant GDP increase commitment. And, basically since the end of World War II, it's been I think it's called the Japanese Defense Force. So they don't have, like, by doctrine, they don't have any expeditionary capabilities. It's really just a homeland defense force. And that's changing. They're essentially modernizing their force to be able to do some things abroad. And I think it's the same case in South Korea. Yeah, you're right. I was just listening to something the other day about some of the war games involved with North Korea, and it's like some ridiculous number of artillery pieces, right, that are along the demilitarized zone there, and all of them, or just about all of them, can reach Seoul. And I think they had run a war game about what it would take the amount of time it would take to take those artillery pieces out, and it was like 2 weeks, which is a lot of time to destroy a city for tens of thousands of artillery pieces. So, yeah, I agree that there's some pretty dramatic changes afoot. I think generally, I don't know about the nuke stuff. I mean, all that stuff is essentially theory, right? We're the only country that's actually used one. And so the deterrence has worked through the Cold War, but there were a lot of very close calls. You think about Cuban Missile Crisis, and there was a woman who just came out with a book. I can't remember her name, but she was making the podcast circuit, and it was basically about what nuclear war might look like, and there was a bunch of instances she covered of close calls, essentially. And just there were several that were just human error issues, right? Somebody reading a radar screen wrong or not knowing what it is, and escalating it very close to somebody pushing the big red button just because somebody made a mistake. So obviously, the more parties that have that capability, the odds of a mistake increase, and that's bad news for the planet, and everybody that lives on it.
Yeah, I just am trying to think this through. If I was South Korean or Polish and had aggressive, neighbors right there with what China's doing in South China Sea, and or Japan, or the Philippines even, and or Russia's aggression in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder if it wouldn't be pertinent for those leaders to actually start looking into this. I have no idea what it would take for them to. I'm sure they have the technological capability to develop nuclear weapons on their own. I don't know how long it would take for them to do that, or if they would, tap into something. But the nuclear umbrella that the U.S. has covered for all these countries, certainly, if that changes, that definitely changes the metric. If you're dealing with the nuclear power, Poland has if Poland had its own nuclear weapons, there's certainly a deterrent against Russia, right? Do anything to Poland. So
I don't know. I mean,
it's just interesting.
Maybe, but maybe not, right? Because they are already under the umbrella. So what does it matter who has them, as long as that deterrence capability exists. I don't know if that changes the calculus
Well, I guess
much.
the change would be perhaps the U.S. commitment to the umbrella. Um, for example, the debate over Ukraine right now between just between the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign. I mean, you saw Zelensky visited the U.S., spoke at the UN, and then he went to some like munitions factory in Pennsylvania,
Yep.
and the factory floor with the yeah, I think it's Pennsylvania
Yep.
with the Pennsylvanian governor. Did you see that?
Yeah. And with Biden.
Yeah, and the idea, and then I saw the Trump campaign criticized that as election interference, and uh, Trump said, something that Zelensky's the best salesman in the world. He comes to the U.S. and leaves with $60 billion every time, and so there's concern amongst the Trump wing, the Republican Party at least, about the continuing to support that effort. I don't know. It's just an interesting idea if the U.S. does pull back from that commitment for whatever reason. Politically, winds have definitely changed in the U.S. for sure, and I think part of that is a result of the war on terrorism, especially Iraq, and all the years we were in Afghanistan. But if that does change, just how that might affect, defense moving forward. If you could conceptually, just playing this out, you could see how all of a sudden the Western European NATO countries could form their own bloc and create their own nuclear capability umbrella type thing. I saw recently a story. I can't remember, it was an article. I'm trying to find. I didn't put it in a ret, but it was an argument for Russia or for Germany to rearm. Because I know Germany's military has been under question quite frequently, but that was part of the argument, that a strong German armed military is part of the deterrent in Europe.
Yeah, well, I think Poland is filling that gap, right? They're primed to have the largest land army in Europe here, like within the next year or two. They really, I mean, for some obvious reasons, they're right on the border, and they have a lot of history of just getting really screwed in conflicts
Yeah, I
that weren't
know.
their own, right? They're just between some warring parties, more or less. But Germany's coming under a lot of scrutiny for that. I just saw yesterday they're looking at another year of a slight GDP decline.
In Germany?
Yeah. So I'm sure
Okay.
that's a contributing factor, for their domestic politics. It's just that's a hard sell when if people are struggling to some degree, say, we're going to spend this money on building the military. Whether or not it's the right thing or whatever the case may be, it's just a hard sell, obviously.
Well, we do know that I think the U.S. spending on military is going to reduce for sure. If it's not because of a policy change, it's going to be the deficit in the budget. You're hearing military-industrial complex complaints from from the Trump campaign, and more questions about military spending and waste and stuff like that. So I think for sure the U.S. military budget is going to decline. If it's not policy, it's going to be the deficit, and the U.S. debt is going to affect it. There's just right now the way things are going, there's just no way we can avoid that. So at least from that perspective, the U.S. military is going to conceptually shrink. I guess I'll pivot to another article that we talked about a little bit last week, was drones, and there were 3 articles in a ret that I had for this week. One is about an army unit that is doing some stuff on electronic warfare to fight drones. Another one is a U.S. 101st Airborne has actually created a 9-person unit, that specifically is flying drones around for reconnaissance and potential, attacking other forces, mirroring what has been done in Ukraine. The drone usage in Ukraine, of course, has had a real impact. We discussed that last week about potential future military conflict. But just as interesting, there are 2 companies that have won proposals. The Air Force has wanted to create a drone wingman that would fly with its fighters. So the idea would be have like an F-35 fighter out, and then you have a drone wingman that would fly with it. And I was just reading the story that these 2 companies, I think one is General Dynamics or something. I'll have to look at. The other is Anduril, which is a really new defense company. Yeah. You've heard about that before. How do you say it?
I think it's Anduril.
Anduril.
Yeah,
I've heard that guy. There. Oh, really? Yeah, I've heard that guy interviewed and stuff. The guy who started it, which is really interesting. I can't remember the number. It was more of a, but anyway, these 2 companies won the initial design concepts and have both come forward with their initial designs. They aren't flying yet. But I understand like these drones, their wingmen are going to be pretty much storage units for more missiles. So, the F-35 can only keep so many missiles on its wings or whatever, and the drone will fly alongside it and carry more missiles, so it'll actually increase the armament capabilities of the F-35. I don't know if the drone's going to be protecting it in a dogfight or whatever, but I thought that was just interesting. And of course, the same effect on the naval side with the naval drones for Ukraine that have had so much impact in the Crimea and the Black Sea. And I know the U.S. Navy is developing its own offensive type drones. Anyway, drone technology is coming, and this was just something that was really solid. That I thought was really interesting. Any comments about that or anything that you read that's interesting on the drone side?
So when I think I was in high school, I grew up outside of DC and was a nerdy on this stuff growing up. So I would go to like think tank conferences when I was in high school. Don't judge me. And I remember going.
What a nerd!
I remember going to one that had an Air Force general on it. It was about, automation essentially. And this was, 15 years ago now, at least, more than that. And there was an Air Force general there, and, all their generals are pilots for the most part. And certainly their leadership is at the institutional level. Anyways, this guy, somebody asked that question during the Q&A segment and said, what do you see the future of the Air Force in terms of automation? He's, and you couldn't have found a more dedicated to his thought response on this. He said there will never be unmanned systems in fighter jets. And, sure as shit, that's going to change for sure. And it just kind of makes sense to have some variety of automation in that. There's obviously some restrictions in terms of what pilots can do and what they can't do. Pilots got to sleep and pilots got to eat and piss and shit. Their body can only take so many G forces that, if the human body is underperforming the weapon system, that's a problem. And, just let alone the fact potentially keeping one more person out of direct harm. So yeah, that stuff's definitely coming fast.
You made a comment last week that, the future warfare may be robots fighting robots, and boy, it seems to be where we're kind of headed. I have seen where, right, not only does the fighter pilot only be able to take, so many hours of training, and maybe this is what you mentioned when you mentioned the G forces. a drone could take much higher G forces than a fighter pilot could in a plane. I
Right.
think the maneuverability of an airplane is somewhat limited by what G forces the pilot can take, right? So if you have a drone that can take much more G forces, then it could maneuver much tighter than a man aircraft, and therefore be much more deadly. And then you could have swarms of drones, and they're cheaper. And I think that here they're trying to make them for like $30 million a piece, which is F-35 is like $1 billion a piece, so they're
Right. Yeah.
relatively cheaper. See, yeah, it's just really anyway. Things are definitely moving rapidly in this in this area, and I just wonder what it means about the future of not only warfare but manpower in the U.S. military.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the type of jobs, right? Now you've got soldiers, the 101st, who aren't carrying weapons on the front line. They're carrying you know virtual reality headsets and flying drones around.
Yeah. The Black Sea fleet deal is super interesting. I read something about it. I mean, everything, the Ukrainians have essentially knocked out the capability of the Black Sea fleet with these drone boats, and they were all constructed on site. Like there was no major. They just tried shit out, see what was working. They're super low profile, so they're hard to shoot and all that stuff, and they're just loaded with explosives. And that goes back to there's some. I remember there was some publicized war games when against Iran, right, in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a really, if there's any surface warfare officers listening, they'll know about this way more than me, but a really narrow gap entering, Iranian water space, and we lost in those war games. It was like we essentially took unacceptable losses because of these, like, the speedboat concept and stuff like that. So you take those speedboats, but you don't put anybody on them. That's going to be a challenge for a carrier group.
Yeah, if you have, you can send 1,000 of them.
Right,
Even if you can
exactly.
knock out 90%, it only takes one getting through. So interesting. Some stuff that in the first responder was really interesting. There was a story that's in a red about Baltimore firefighters respond up to 6,000 opioid overdoses a year, which is just incredible. My family's been touched by drug use for sure. And alcohol, I don't know if it's opioid specific, but um, I think just about every family in America has been touched by these opioid stuff. And I did see recently where opioid overdoses are down slightly for whatever reason, but it's just amazing. The extent that this is in as part of us. I know that, did we discuss this before, but the number of Americans who die of overdoses a year, overdoses a year, is pretty staggering, that have died. I looked it up right now. But
Yeah,
anyway,
that's a massive number.
looked it up. But yeah, that's just one town, or no one city, one major U.S. city. Yeah, so AI is working on this question about the number of opioid overdoses a year. Wow. In 2023, this is Chat GPT, so I'm not too sure what the resource is. 107,543 drug overdose deaths. And about 80% of those, 81,000, were opioids. A modest decline from peak in previous years. So 83,000 people in 2003 in the U.S., or 81,000 died of opioid deaths last year. Let me compare that to car accidents. Well, we lost 50,000 troops in Vietnam, right? So
70,
70, is it?
I
Okay.
believe so. Yeah.
I'm just trying to look up the number of car accident fatalities. But that's just an incredible number, for sure. Of course, there's a political issue with the border and fentanyl coming across the border. Said so. If 2023, according to ChatGPT, 44,500 people U.S. died of car accidents. So opioid deaths is killing more people than car accidents right now. Anyway, there's nothing to comment about that. I just thought that statistic was staggering and brought home again for me what an issue this is. The other, any comments about that?
Yeah,
Did you ever deal with that when you were in a fire department?
Yeah, definitely a lot. I mean, everybody's got
What did
Narcan
that look
now.
at? Did you ever respond to a overdose or a death?
Oh yeah, dozens.
What was the scene like?
Exactly what you would expect it to be. It's usually
like all I've seen is in the movies, right? So I'm not too sure we're in that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. No, I mean it's usually younger folks, usually not in a great neighborhood, and almost always it would almost always come in batches too, because it seemed like there would be bad batches of drugs that would come in, right? And so there would be this like spike in overdoses because nobody's testing this stuff obviously for whatever you test it for. And that was I guess fairly early on with the fentanyl stuff, but the opioid stuff has been around for a long time, mostly coming from American pharmaceutical companies. But yeah, I mean, not breathing or breathing incredibly shallow, it's just a shit show. But Narcan's a hell of a drug, counter drug. I mean, it was always you always had to watch out. I'm sure lots of guys listening, Ellie and Fire know this, but when you give somebody Narcan, they come out, and sometimes they'll come out of it swinging.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's it's an immediate counter to the opioid, so they'll come out really fast and they're confused.
So if you have an overdose and the person's still alive, you give them this Narcan, and then that's the way to bring them back, I guess.
Yep, and it's almost immediate.
So they're not dead, but they're definitely comatose or out.
Yeah, and they're
how
on
do you
their
recognize
way there.
Do you know how to recognize an overdose versus just someone who's on a trip?
Someone
on a trip, alive or awake?
Yeah. If they're out, so it's either going to be an overdose or cardiac arrest. So you usually try and watch for respirations, which are super shallow with opioids. So it's sometimes a little challenging to tell, but it's kind of there's usually lots of environmental tells, like grandma dies of cardiac arrest, but probably not opioids.
Got it.
So
Do you know how the drug works? Does it just slow your system down where your heart stops, or
no? I don't know the chemistry of it, but it's a direct counter to opioids, so it reverses the effect of opioids immediately.
No, do you know how opioids work when they cause cardiac arrest?
I think it's just such a heavy. They don't cause cardiac arrest necessarily, but they it basically dulls everything down to nothing, more or less. But we would just
like taking a bunch of sleeping pills or something.
Yeah, kind of. But they hand out Narcan everywhere. It's pretty much a free handout, and it sucks because like my wife is a school nurse now, and she ordered Narcan. And this is a K through 8 school.
Wow, is it a shot? I guess it has to be a shot, right?
No. It's usually it comes in a couple different ways, but usually it's a nasal spray.
Oh, nasal spray. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So every cop carries it. More often than not, I think probably cops apply Narcan more than anybody.
Right.
And let's see if I remember. It's been a while. I think it's like 4 milligrams per nostril or something like that. I can't remember. It's been a while. But it's super easy to do. And it gets people out quick. There was one instance, tell a story. It was one of those like, oh, you appreciate street smarts pretty quick. I was pretty brand new on my fire crew, and get a call to a restaurant and for a cardiac arrest. And we get there, and there's a guy, unresponsive in a booth, and he's with his family, and his family was like oddly not freaking out, but they kind of wouldn't tell us anything. And but he was a normal looking dude. So like 90% of the overdoses I saw were from people you would expect to overdose, just by appearance, for better or worse. And that's just usually, they just look like shit, not a race thing, not a sex thing, just like they look like shit. But this guy looks, completely normal clothes, all that kind of stuff, just like he was out for a meal with his family. And so we're starting to.
How old was he? Was he like in his 30s, 40s?
Yeah, he was probably in his early 40s. And me and my buddy start to pull him out of the booth to start doing compressions. And my captain, Lane, just really fucking good fire captain. He sees him and says, give him Narcan. And sure as shit, he popped right up after we gave him Narcan. He was like, after the fact, we were like, how did you know? And he was like, he had some very slight burn on a couple of his fingers. So he was a meth user. So it was a bit of an educated guess, but just some of those like street smart tells that you get from.
Plus the family wasn't freaking out, so they knew he was.
Yeah, there was like the mother was freaking out, but the father just looked pissed. Got it. It was a weird scenario to walk into, but he noticed it from the burns. And meth isn't an opioid necessarily, but it won't do any harm. So we gave it to him, and he popped right up out of it. You gotta appreciate.
That kind of brings me to my next story.
Experience.
The street sparks.
Yeah.
The next story is kind of I guess, again, I think that the first responders and the danger they face is really unrelated. And I'm seeing more and more cases of firemen, getting shot at or ambulance workers. Anyway, this is a story in Texas. I can't remember if it's Dallas or something. Like a 70-year-old woman calls 911 and says she's fallen down. And when the first responders respond, it's typical. I'm sure it would be ambulance, fire truck, and police. She starts firing at him. No weapons, weapon shots. And so I don't think anybody was injured. But who would expect in that type of situation, the 911 call, elderly lady, falling down, needs the ambulance, and all of a sudden she's the one who's firing weapons at him. Anyway, it just reinforces for me that these tactical athletes are deployed every day and really can never let their guard down for anything, and that just must be so stressful every damn day. I can't imagine how stressful that is. And you can see how more and more for first responders. I know that for firemen that touching fentanyl and the fentanyl stuff. I've heard of fentanyl poisoning. Did you ever hear that or see that? People you worked with, fentanyl poisoning, firefighters?
Yeah, I saw it once with a cop who was on scene with us, and he found a bag and opened it up, and some dust came out, and he dropped like a bag of bricks. It was pretty impressive.
Wow.
Yeah.
You had to Narcan him, I guess?
No. Maybe the medics did. I'm not sure, but it just knocked him out, kind of like very temporarily. He was fine, but it's definitely not something to play around with.
Did you respond to an overdose in Montana? You were at service there?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh, really? Was there any difference in I guess it just shows the extent of where it is. I mean, was it like rural low? Was it rural areas or downtown or college students or what? Or do you remember?
Yeah, it's mostly. I never, definitely not college students, but that might have been. Um, we didn't cover the college area, so probably there might be some instances there, but usually it was kind of the same thing. I mean, there's definitely poverty-stricken areas. I mean, it's just kind of like the difference between trailer parks out this way and housing projects on the East Coast.
Got it.
Grandma never shot at me though.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Well, the next story is something we talked about last week was the fastest known time on the Grand Teton. And I think it was a Italian guy or whatever, got up and down it in under 3 hours, 2 hours, 50 minutes, and 50 seconds. Anyway, I guess Outside Magazine owns the website that has the official fastest known time records,
Yeah.
however they do that. And they won't recognize the record because he cut at least one switchback on the trail. And so he doesn't, get that, which I assume they need to have some type of standard, right?
I guess. I would think the standard would be from bottom to the top.
I guess it's up to them to make up this, I do know that because I've been up that trail and I've been down it with guides before, and you are not supposed to cut the switchbacks, not because of an ethical thing, because of environmental damage, right? So,
right.
Kind of making a new trail, definitely, even the guides I was with, you weren't supposed to, they're running down, and I'm not. They're just taking me up there to be mean to me, and so they're getting down as fast as they can, and they would, show me some that would cut, through the couple of switchbacks. But anyway, I thought that was just interesting, and this type of, there has been some concern, I think, raised ethically and from the in the mountain athlete world about, the ethics of fastest known times, and the idea of creating a competition of mountaineering. There years ago there's this award. It's like the Golden Ice Axe Award. It's called the Golden PLA or something. It's an alpinist award that's awarded every year to the most impressive alpine climb. Let me see if I can look it up. Alpinist Golden. And I knew a couple of guides I worked with who were actually nominated for it. And there was one case where it's called the PLA d'Or. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And there's controversy about whether or not it encourages risk. It's called the Golden Ice Axe. But there was one alpinist who won it, who wouldn't accept it. Yes, Slovene alpinist Marko Prizelli in 2007 refused to accept the award. And the awards foster an environment where climbers are encouraged to overstretch their capacity or take performance-boosting substances and take inconsiderate risks. But you can see just from this guy who ran up the Teton and came back and set the fastest known time, you can see the financial advantage for him to do that in terms of sponsorships, right?
Sure.
So he perhaps would get sponsorships because of the notoriety. There's another story that's in read this week about a lady who just broke her own fastest known time for the Appalachian Trail. Anyway, it's just an interesting ethical idea about mountain sports, especially mountaineering, alpinism, and about why you do it. And this has come up before, but anyway, the fastest known time records are a push in against the idea of maybe perhaps doing it for the right reasons, whatever the right reasons are. Any comments about that or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, right? I mean, because I don't know that it's any different than like what are the motivations 50 years ago, 60 years ago when this started becoming a sport versus now, right? It's certain, particularly for kind of those first ascent folks. There's certainly for a long time it was, you know, your rich guys who had the funding to do that because it was something that they loved. And now the tables have turned a little bit where it's something that you can potentially earn some income from, but I don't think that's necessarily the primary reason somebody's going to do that. There's a lot easier ways to make money.
This reminds me of a couple of things. It was I guess the story about this one mountain athlete I worked with. He was an elite guy, but he wasn't sponsored, and but he would post some of the things he'd done, or he got some local press. And he was known for really fast movement, mountain movement, and it was really incredible. I remember hiking up Snow King in Jackson and getting passed by him, and just going, "Oh wow!" He was my size, but one of those guys who weighed 145 pounds. Anyway, and I had this one mountain athlete who was sponsored by North Face, so on the North Face athletes team, which is pretty much the pinnacle of mountain athlete sponsorship because North Face, paid him a salary, and a lot of the sponsorships is just a little bit of stipend and gear. But this guy actually had, the North Face athlete team is actually relatively lucrative from a sponsored athlete perspective, and he really admired this individual, the athlete that I'm talking about, because he did all these badass things and really didn't publicize them or search for sponsorships. And then on the other side of it, I had this individual would get criticized by. So he lived in Jackson, and I grew up in Pinedale, Wyoming, which is a little bit south of there. But there was a guy down there in Pinedale who just a small world actually. His mom was like in my school. He's in my grade. But anyway, he really criticized this guy in Jackson because he would take in, on social media, put his exploits out there and what he had done, and he thought he was self-promoting. And he said, there's nothing new here. We've been doing this in Pinedale for years and years before. For example, he do a run in the Wind River Wilderness, Wind River Mountains, which is Pinedale is one of the gateways to that, and and there are lots of guys in Pinedale who do that, do that stuff, kind of unknown, alpinist. Anyway, it was just you see these two sides of it, where on one hand, at this individual in Jackson who was good, the North Face athlete admired him for his humility, and the and the Pinedale athlete thought he was overly self-promoting. It's so interesting. I know that this has been something I've criticized sponsored hunters for, and because it brings undue attention to hunting, especially when it pushes on the hunting side. You don't become a sponsored hunter by killing small elk and small deer, right? It's the big ones that are considered impressive, and so there's this incentive to go after these bigger animals, and then it gives the impression amongst the greater public that all hunters are trophy hunters, and which is politically controversial. But anyway, there's this idea in hunting, or the idea, I've read this and I've kind of experienced myself about the different stages of hunting. And so when you first start hunting, you think it's impossible. You're kind of self-taught. Like how do you don't even know where to look for the game, or when. And then when you start having a little bit of success, you just go out and kill anything you can because you finally get some success. And then you, after you've had some success, you start getting more discerning on what you're chasing in terms of the game that you actually take. And then you can kind of move towards, the bigger animals. I knew there were some pretty elite deer hunters, mule deer hunters in small towns where I grew up, and kind of unknown guys, and they they targeted big mule deer, which is some of the most difficult animals and rare animals to hunt, even more than big elk in the West. And every year they would go out and target these animals. They wouldn't shoot a deer if it wasn't massive. And so they got more discerning. But then the final stage is that you realize that it's not about the killing at all. It's just mostly about being out there and becoming a better hunter in terms of your woodsmanship and your game, and just enjoying the process. And I finally, I was never a trophy hunter, just not that good, but I do now when I go hunting really enjoy the process. And does it really matter if I kill something? I'm such a terrible hunter. Often I don't. But anyway, I just don't know if there's the same. I haven't heard of that same type of stages for mountaineering, at least articulated that way. But it could just be my ignorance, and maybe it is. But I just think that's interesting. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean the flip side is increased presence via whatever digital or social media or whatever format increases interest in the sport, which is going to be a net gain hypothetically, because all of these guys, whether it's hunting or whether it's mountain sports, aid towards the conservation group, right? So the biggest conservation collective is hunters, right? And I would imagine it's something similar with mountain sports. So, when you've got, it's kind of like goes back to the wildland stuff, like when you've got properties that are being built, right on the edge of a national forest area, and they don't allow people to access a trailhead anymore, whatever the case may be. You've got this collective that is increasing in power because of there's more voices, more people to continue to have access. Obviously, like in this part of the world, the public land is like, it's like religion in the South. You don't fuck with public land.
Even in the South. Wow.
No, I'm saying in the South, it's religion. In the West, it's public land. I think those two kind of both elicit extreme reactions.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely a complicated beast, and there's also like a fine line of when something becomes tacky, right? Like overly self-promotional. But I don't really have an issue with it, to be honest with you. I get why somebody might, particularly if it's somebody who's just done something all their life and they don't want to see that area get used, or think it's something that should be kept, secret to some degree. But I think that is probably not a realistic thing for the current world.
I have seen interesting conflicts between environmentalists and I always broke down the mountain sports into two types of sports. The hook and bullet guys and the granola athletes. So hook and bullet is hunters and fishermen, and then the granola are the mountain bikers, rock climbers, backcountry skiers type athletes. There's lots of crossover, right?
Sure.
A few of us would do everything, but there are many more hunters who backcountry ski and stuff than there are backcountry skiers who hunt. Anyway, there's a couple controversies there just in Jackson between these user groups. One was I was actually on this panel that was looking at this wilderness study area, and we wanted to make our task was to make a recommendation to the county commissioners on whether or not to recommend that this area become a wilderness, or leave it like it was, or change the way it was being treated by the Forest Service. The wilderness study area isn't wilderness, but the idea is that it's supposed to be the values of it are supposed to be protected, so it could become wilderness in the future, which means you can't build structures on it, you can't have roads in it, et cetera, et cetera. And the controversy came up with mountain bikers in Jackson, and the mountain bikers had already had one fairly significant trail they had developed in this wilderness study area, and there's no mountain bikes currently allowed in wilderness areas. There aren't any machines at all. Even hang gliders aren't allowed in wilderness areas. And so the mountain bike representative on the group sided with the snowmobilers, who also argued against using the snowmobilers. I would put in the hook and bullet type
Sure.
Athletes, right? So they sided with the snowmobilers and opposed the full on environmental advocates, environmental group advocates who were employees on, like the Sierra Club had a person there, and Wyoming Outdoor Council, and everybody had their own person there. And it was just interesting to see that, where you had a user group who would I consider granola athletes, and they probably all had, were Patagonia and, had donated to environmental groups before, but were arguing against protecting this area as wilderness because of their recreational activity. And the other example was similar there in Jackson. In the Tetons, there's a dwindling mountain sheep population, and the Forest Service had implemented some backcountry ski regulations and restrictions on certain areas to protect the small number of mountain sheep that were, or bighorn sheep, bighorn sheep population that was, in the Tetons. And it was interesting from the people who, the organizations, the guide groups who guided in these areas. And then of course the backcountry skiers. Jackson is an incredible backcountry skiing place, and it's really a training field for high level backcountry skiing because the approach is so small. You kind of go right uphill, and it's real alpine, so it's really a great place to learn, become an incredible backcountry skier. But it was incredible to see some of the arguments as they fought these restrictions. And one of the arguments was made that the sheep are going to die off anyway. We should just let them go and not try to keep the population there. And it was just really an interesting element of dynamics where. And I'm sure that many of these backcountry skiers would consider themselves, who are making these arguments, full-on environmentalists or really concerned about wildlands. But when it came to affecting their own activity, their values kind of changed, their position changed.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the wolf debate. There's so many different angles to it. Although that's usually just seems to be a two-sided debate versus when you start to mess with access issues. I mean, there's a lot of different sports, a lot of people who really care about those sports. That would have been a hilarious room to be a fly on the wall.
In this case, the snowmobilers and the mountain bikers did a much better job of organizing and public comments at the public meetings than the environmentalists did. And the county commission eventually decided not to recommend it, to make no change, so kind of leave it in limbo, which allowed snowmobiling in it in the winter, and I guess potential expansion of mountain biking. Anyway, it's just it came right down to numbers. Really, there are more mountain bikers and
right.
snowmobilers than there were, at least the ones who spoke up.
Which side did the hunting group come down on?
I kind of represented the hunters there, and I was searching for. This is on the wilderness area. I wasn't too involved in the backcountry ski one, but yeah, I really searched. Me and a few others on the panel really searched for some type of compromise. So I think the final one we came posed was to go ahead and keep this wilderness study area as it was. Access was allowed, but there would be seasonal restrictions on mountain biking in the fall and in the early spring to protect newborn elk in the spring, and then backcountry hunting in the fall. If you have a bunch of mountain bikers out there in the fall, kind of sucks for hunting. And then the compromise for the environmental groups was to create actually more wilderness in other areas of the forest that were even more remote and really didn't get any or very little snowmobile and mountain bike use, and because there were other big expanses of area. And that was so interesting because not only did the environment or the mountain bikers and the snowmobilers opposed this compromise, but many of the environmental group representatives did also, because they were pressured by their membership and their boards not to make any compromise when it came to wilderness. Right. Even though they could give up this little piece of this one area from ever becoming wilderness in exchange for even more land becoming wilderness in other areas, they still oppose it. So the compromise, we worked really hard on it, but never really got anywhere. It just shows the incredible, difficult dynamics of public land use, and why I think a lot of it in the West is just deadlocked right now. It's just so difficult.
Yeah, a lot of competing parties.
I think that what is new though is in this case anyway. Traditionally in the Mountain West, it would be the industrial groups that would fight for access. So oil and gas drilling, logging, but those activities in the national forest, at least in Wyoming now, just are they've kind of lost. There's not much logging at all, and it's really difficult for any oil and gas development in treed national forest. Yeah, it's much more it's easier in deserty, sagebrushy BLM land, but treed national forest, it just doesn't go anywhere. But they've been replaced by granola based greenie group or activity groups, mountain bikers and right. and snowmobilers and others. So it's just really interesting.
Any other topics for the day?
I guess the final one is the use of the word like in conversation. So people who it was like this, and then like, and there was a story in a Ret about just about this idea, why do we say like all the time? And I when I had a big staff, there were some females on it, and when they would talk to me, I would start counting the number of times they would say like. It seems like it's primarily a female way of speaking, and I was thinking it was just young people, but then I started looking at the story and looking it up more and more, and I'm Generation X, and sure enough, this started kind of with Generation X in the 80s and 90s. There was a movie called Valley Girl. I don't know if you ever saw it. I think it has Nicolas Cage in it, and this definitely came out when I was in college or high school. I can't remember, but anyway, but I guess that there's an anecdote I read where women in a law firm are discouraged from speaking in this because it just made them sound dumb. And this lady argues that actually people who say like a lot are more intelligent and more emotionally intelligent than others. Just an interesting. I just found it interesting. So I did notice that in one of our earlier discussion than this. I said like as I described something that I caught myself. So
I think it's okay to use every
so
now and then.
you can blame Generation X, my generation, for all the likes you hear when you're talking to people. I thought that there may be this idea that I know it is, and I did find that it's primarily women who use like a lot, and I always wondered, well, would you grow out of it? But we just have a friend who's in her late 30s or early 40s, and she still uses like a lot. So maybe you never grow out of it.
Becomes part of your lexicon.
All right, Charlie. Thanks so much. That's it for today.
All right.